Hello and welcome to the Franz Van Cat interview. I'm Annette Young. 6 weeks into 2012 and the Middle East once again is becoming a flashpoint. In Syria, as President Bashar al-Assad relentlessly pursues his bloody crackdown, even the Syrian National Council says it's coming around to the view that maybe military intervention may be the only option to end the conflict. And in Iran, there's been much sabre rattling. This as the Iranian leadership threatens a preemptive strike against its enemies as tensions rise over its contentious nuclear program. Joining me now from Washington is Robert Malley, the Middle East Director of the International Crisis Group. He also was a former advisor to the Clinton administration. The International Crisis Group is about to release a report about Iran and the risk of war. Robert Malley, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, we'll get to Iran in a moment, but let's start by talking about Syria. And the death toll is rising by the day, if not by the hour. We've just been hearing that the Syrian National Council says it's even coming to the view that military intervention might be the only way to bring this conflict to an end. Is that a concept you would support or agree with?
No, not at this point. I think there are two questions. First, will it end it and how will it end it? I mean, it's not clear that military intervention, and we could get into the details of the different kinds, would really end it. I mean, it simply may accelerate the descent of what already is a tragic conflict into an even more dangerous civil war with more deaths, more civilian deaths and others. So that's the first question. Will it actually end it? But second, how will it end it? Assuming it does end after some time, what will have been left behind? What will Syria look like? Will it be fragmented? Who will the opposition be? Will there be internal conflict of a kind that one could only imagine? Plus, Syria is the kind of country that can both project and attract chaos and instability. And if you start pouring weapons into the country to different groups, who knows how the Syrian regime will react, and who knows what will happen within Syria. So, there's some cases where there really are no good solutions, and this may well be one. And the notion, which I understand, it's natural, it's logical, it's human to want for the opposition to say we need help, for even many Syrians within Syria to say we need military help. But I think, first of all, it's quite unlikely that foreign countries in the West in particular are prepared to do it. But as I said, we also have to think long and hard about whether and how this would actually help the situation.
So, Robert Malley, what exactly would be the best way to end this conflict?
Listen, there's a series of possibilities. Unfortunately, their desirability is inversely proportional to their likelihood in many ways. The best outcome would be a political settlement, and the best way to do that probably would be to have major international countries, some that back the regime and some that have been supporting the opposition. Take Russia and Turkey, for example, and others that could come together, agree on a solution, some kind of transition plan, because obviously it would have to entail a transition from this regime, some assurances certainly for the Alawite community and for certain elements of the regime, but a clear transition plan. That would be the best way. It doesn't look particularly likely today for a host of reasons. The other option would be for one or the other side to prevail. It doesn't look very likely at this point either. The regime has superior firepower, but it has inferior support, and it seems to be losing more support by the day. And then the third option, of course, which is maybe the most likely, but certainly the worst, is further descent into civil war, sectarian civil war, fragmentation of the country, more involvement by foreign countries inside Syria, and as I said, greater projection of Syrian instability to its borders, whether it's Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, or Turkey.
But Robert, there's been also a lot of talk in recent days about setting up humanitarian corridors. Do you think that's a viable concept at the moment?
There are many logistical questions that are associated with that. Where would they be? How would they be protected? What would one do if Syria were to retaliate? What would the next step be? You have a humanitarian corridor, but what are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to topple the regime or simply provide humanitarian assistance? A lot of the areas where you would think of having a humanitarian corridor are areas of where you'd have elements of the regime, elements of the civilian population. I think if you go through the details of all of the options, whether it's a no-fly zone, a humanitarian corridor, arming the opposition, there are very great risks associated with them, and none of them are sort of these pinprick operations. You settle a humanitarian corridor, and that's it. You have to protect it. You have to see what you do with it if Syria, which will consider it an intrusion on its sovereignty, reacts. And what will happen in those areas? Are you intending those to be areas where the opposition can regroup and train and then attack, or simply an area where civilians can be protected? So the time may come where some of these issues where the situation becomes so dire that we have to consider some of them, but all of them are risky, and all of them entail far greater international interference than I think some of their proponents are contemplating at this time.
Are what we're seeing a civil war? And if so, what are the implications for the region?
You know, there are many academic disputes about how you define a civil war. Clearly, this is developing into a civil war. Whether it is one already or not is almost irrelevant. What's happening is you're having violence throughout the country. You're having an opposition that is increasingly armed, again, for understandable reasons. A regime that has been armed and is willing to fight almost to the bitter end, it appears. You have outsiders that are prepared to support their respective allies, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. And what began very much as an indigenous, peaceful uprising is turning, at this point, more and more, not yet entirely, but more and more into a proxy war as outsiders are trying to see in Syria sort of the battlefield for a regional war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and others. And so, again, whether we call it a civil war or not, it certainly is an arena in which countries are projecting their interests, and their interests are translating into a aggravated war, a more serious war in Syria. And as I said, the risks of it spilling over, whether it's through refugees or whether it's through instability in Lebanon, which would be the first and most likely arena for it, but also Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, all of those are possibilities. Don't forget also that Syria possesses significant amounts of chemical weapons, and in whose hands will those fall? Will Israel decide at one point that it wants to bomb those facilities? And that may be more likely, in fact, and come sooner than Israel bombing any nuclear facility in Iran. Let's not forget that it's easier for Israel to attack Syria, and they may believe that that's a more urgent task out of fear that those chemical weapons could fall into hostile hands.
Now, Robert, you just mentioned there are two countries that I want to talk to you about, and that's Israel and Iran. Given what you just said, do you think an Israeli military strike against Iran is likely in the near future?
You know, I think the situation has rarely been both more confusing and more ominous. I mean, every day we hear different messages. You have Syrian officials who say, Israeli officials who say that they have to strike, that the time is running out. And then at the same time, the same officials say, well, nothing's decided, we still have time. You have U.S. officials who at one point say that a military intervention would be reckless, would be dangerous, but then the next day say that all options are on the table. And whenever an official says that all options are on the table, he or she means one option in particular, which is the military option. You have bellicose statements from Iran one day, then their apparent acceptance of negotiations the next. It's unclear what's happening. Certainly, there is a desire on the part of some Israelis to stop the Iranian nuclear program, and a willingness among some, again, maybe not the majority, but among some, to intervene militarily before the end of the year. And that is something that I think is, if not new, at least more intense today than it certainly has been over the preceding years. But weighed against that is U.S. opposition, U.S. strong opposition to an Israeli military strike, the difficulty of an Israeli military strike, and all of the adverse consequences of a military strike. And one could only imagine what would happen in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Gulf, in the Palestinian territories, if Iran were to retaliate against an Israeli strike. So I think it still is not likely, but it is possible, and I would say more possible today than it's been ever before, because Israel feels more threatened today. It feels that Iran is entering what it calls a zone of immunity, because it sees that in the U.S. there's a presidential election, and during a presidential election, a U.S. presidential candidate is unlikely to oppose an Israeli military strike, and because with now the U.S. having departed Iraq, Israel can fly over Iraqi airspace more unencumbered, and therefore has reduced the logistical difficulties of striking Iran.
Briefly, Robert, because we're coming close to the end of the program, I know that your organisation, the International Crisis Group, is just about to release a report where it talks about the Turkish approach being the way to deal with the Iranian problem, that being Turkey adopting a very direct and energetic diplomatic engagement with the Iranians, and the argument is from the ICG that's something that should be looked at by the international community. Can you just very briefly take us through that and why you think that's a viable option for the global powers as such?
Well, it's not clear that it's viable. I think what's clear is that the current approach, the sort of the dual-track approach that the US administration and the Europeans have promoted, has failed. And that approach was premised on the notion that by imposing more sanctions on Iran, you're going to compel them to back down and to give in on the nuclear file. And if they don't give in, you just impose more sanctions. What's actually happened is that the more sanctions you impose, the more the Iranians dig their heels. They don't want to surrender to sanctions. They feel like the West wants to topple their regime. And so what we've had is we haven't had a policy. We've had sort of the tail wagging the dog, sanctions sort of directing diplomacy rather than diplomacy being at the helm. And so whenever we have an encounter between Iranians and Europeans or Americans that fail, we just impose more sanctions. And that's not going to produce a result. What the Turks say is sanctions are not going to produce the outcome you want. Pressure alone won't produce the outcome you want. You need to engage, and you need to engage more than simply episodically. Let's have one meeting, it fails, then you impose more sanctions. They say, let's engage Iranians continuously. Let's try to get small steps first. Let's put a real meaningful proposal, a nuclear compromise on the table. Maybe it will work. Maybe it won't. I mean, it may well be, again, that this is not a problem that is going to be solved by this kind of approach, but it's certainly worth trying that rather than hoping against hope that more sanctions are going to convince the regime that already feels under siege that it should surrender and therefore weaken itself at a time when it feels like much of the West and much of the Gulf Arab countries want to topple it.
Robert Malley, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with us. And that's it for this edition of the Frans van Kat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.